This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
We have a very special talk to begin with because you're not only getting Marina, Wallace, but also Martin Kemp. And they promised to speak for the appropriate amount of time each. That's up to me. So Marina Wallace is Professor of Curating and Director of Art Act, and she's interested in the relationships between art and science, representation of medicine's relation to art. She's curated a number of major and groundbreaking exhibitions, including Spectacular Bodies, which I remember very well, which Martin Kemp was involved with too. She's also Art with Brain and Mind at the Science Museum, which is fascinating, but she's currently contributing towards a visual interpretation and dissemination of science knowledge for the European Union project on new mathematical models of cell division. Martin Kemp is Emeritus Professor of the History of Art at Oxford. He's written extensively on imagery and art and science from the Renaissance and present day. I particularly enjoyed his columns in Nature called Science in Culture, and there's another book called Visualizations, which everybody ought to have. And he was also, as I said, involved in Spectacular Bodies and the Leonardo da Vinci Experiment Design at the Victoria and Albert Museum in 2006. So Marina, the paradox of representation.
Thank you. So, just to say a few things as a preamble before I start. Since I call the paradox of representation, I fear it's going to be the paradox of the presentation, because I'm completely overwhelmed by a series of events that have been happening in my personal professional life until last night, which fortunately went all well, but it required an awful lot of drinking and work. And so so I put something together from the point of view of an art person, art historian, artist, somebody who works with artists, but certainly not in your field. I'm not in your field, but I'm very curious of it. And so whatever I say will be from that point of view. And the other thing is that I am going blatantly to reuse some material that I used last night, but you weren't there, so you wouldn't know. There are only two people who were there, so they'll get the whole story, that part of the story again. But I think that was, I thought, a few weeks ago, it was quite a good way of saving my energies. But I hope it makes sense. I sort of changed it a little bit for it to make sense. I wrote it down, because I saw Jonathan Miller wrote it down, so I wrote it down too. And I'm going to read it and operate the slides. And then after half an hour, Chris is going to tell me to shut up and Martin is going to come instead. So, first of all, I was here only for Jonathan's talk yesterday because I had to rush off for the preparation of my event. So I'm sorry that I missed the rest. And I just, in my mind, just jotted down a few of the things that I gathered from yesterday that maybe were useful in the future for what I will be doing. The first one is the top-downness, which I liked a lot, that Chris talked about. And that I felt fitted in beautifully with the concept of the fact, what I was going to say, that context is absolutely fundamental, historical context. But the context in terms of why we paint, why one makes an image, and I'll say more about that. And that is from yesterday, because the light that falls onto our eyes is meaningless. And it is what we do with that information that changes everything. I think Colin said something like that. And of course, the complexity of sensory phenomena in looking at multimodal integration and challenging the traditional models of sensory knowledge, which I understand is what Barry Smith and colleagues are about, is also something that stimulated my brain cells. And from Jonathan, I got lots of things, obviously, but also that we see by learning to see. And the brain evolved mechanisms for finding patterns and finding relationships in what we see and associating those relationships with behavioral meanings. So it's complex. But what is simple, I think, is that the most sophisticated of all of all visual optical illusions is a drawing, any drawing, or painting, any painting, or a sculpture, or a photograph, or this is by a contemporary artist whose slide I showed last night, Vanessa B. Prof.
Could we get the lights down a bit somewhere? I don't know where they go.
Or, of course, Patrick Hughes' pictures. And the ability to create a world that solidifies into perspective, sculpture, painting, and solid space. Or also a film, or a piece of dance, or, as Jonathan said yesterday, a piece of theatre, which we were lovely at the beginning, all involving movement. So, let me see if that's one I wanted to go to. Either that or not. So, I also pillaged a little bit from things that I was reading in order to think about this. And one of the things, I went back to the book that was mentioned yesterday, also because I was talking to Colin some weeks ago about it, the Colin Haddon chapter. So it's edited by Gregory and Richard Gregory and Gombrich, where they say that scientists fight errors and artists court illusions, and that science may be the white knight seeking truth, and art the black knight sunk in error. And many illusions of perception are more than mere errors. They may be experiences in their own right. The expression experience is very relevant at the moment. They can illuminate reality. It is this power of illusion to illuminate which artist somehow commands. To the scientist, illusion presents a curious challenge, for though they are not phenomena of the physical world, they are phenomena just because they are a deviation from what is taken to be reality. I grapple with the comparison between what artists and scientists say all the time, so this is what I normally do. This is not a pipe, it is only an uncomplicated image, and I thought this would be on gullibility. What I did for the rest, I have some cues here, some questions. So I just posed some questions, and I will leave them as questions. Which are the brain functions that allow us to be fooled by images, by pictorial representation at large? And why are we gullible whenever in the presence of representation that are that are not intended to be sophisticated optically in an extreme sense? And what are the factors that allow pure and simple images to fool us, to persuade us? The general problem of meaning is how the mind imposes intentionality on entities that are not intrinsically intentional. And beliefs, hopes, desires, perceptual experiences, and intention. I told you, I thought I'd done that, but it's still... Sorry, I'm going to switch it off. I put it on vibration and it still rings. So, jump that because of the phone, and I'm going to the image that I used yesterday. Yesterday I used this image that I feel can be adapted to today's context. So, I was talking about Italian culture and how visual representation of Italian culture transposed from the past to contemporary days. And I took this poster from Hotel Spa Terme Colella in Ischia, where Gaetano Colella stood for the political elections of the province of Naples in summer 2009. His electoral campaign, including publicizing his own image on a poster displayed in the streets of Ischia, just opposite the entrance of his spa. The poster exhorted the citizens of Ischia and Procida to rise again. The effigy of Colella is associated with the Olympus of Italian politics. The direct visual link is with the preeminent representative of Italian politics at the time, the then Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi. Colella and Berlusconi appeared to smile side by side, silhouetted against a vivid blue sky, embroidered with the contours of a world map. However, this is only a fictitious coupling, because if we submit the image to careful scrutiny, it seems obvious from signs that are not immediately evident that the proximity between the two politicians is the result of a masterly photomontage. The two characters are side by side, at the same level, but their outfits reveal an incoherence that unearths the fiction. Berlusconi,
wears a formal jacket and tie. Colella, on the other hand, is dressed casually. His shirt is open around the neck and he wears no tie. If the pose had been real, both would have worn similar clothes. The photo montage involuntarily brings us back to a strategy that was common to devotional images in the Renaissance in the 15th century. Painters were commissioned by local patrons to help perpetrate their image by placing it pictorially next to that of saints and Madonnas. The Carafa Chapel in Santa Maria sopra Minerva, decorated by Filippino Libion, commissioned by the Neapolitan Cardinal Oliviero Carafa in 1418. This is this image that represents at its center the kneeling figure of Oliviero Carafa, also Neapolitan, also benefactor of humanity in the sense of Colella, being introduced by St. Thomas Aquinas to the Madonna. An angel witnesses the encounter. These are invented images, but are meant to be believable. A careful illustration, and illustration is a word that I use generally, saying that we don't do illustrations in the collaboration in our work in art and science. An illustration of the message that needs to be put across by the patron through the painter. I want you to believe this image. I want you to believe that I am great, that this is testified by my proximity to the Madonna, to St. Thomas Aquinas, and to the angel, and therefore you should vote for me. So it's a pack of lies. And after all, this is what electoral campaigns are all about. So the question is, with photography, does this kind of invention become more believable? In Colella's poster, Berlusconi's guardian angel is missing, but the population of Ischia and Procida are exhorted to rise again, implying a prostration and an imminent salvation in the highest. The angel is virtual in the references to a heavenly salvation. Both the Carafa and the Colella representations are invented in different ways, and yet they're meant to be believable according to a kind of visual illusion that is highly complex in its context and artistic meaning, the intentionality of which is made up of a series of predicaments to be found in different fields of knowledge. Art history is one of these, of course, but it has to be coupled with areas of knowledge to really work properly as an analysis. How long was that? Was that too long? I've got lots to go.
Marina, is it possible to do it slightly slower? Without the lights, I find it difficult to see your mouth and therefore...
Okay, I'll speak. I'm just worried that it's too long. Okay, more slowly. So the title of this bit is The Great Spanish Picture, and it's also the classical representation. The question is, why, after over 3 centuries, does Las Meninas continue to bother us? Its fascination clearly extends beyond the interest of art historians and admirers of Spanish painting. Picasso painted no less than 45 studies modeled after Las Meninas, and Foucault begins his analysis of the classical 17th century system of thought, sorry, I'm now not seeing, in Les Mots et les Choses, with the discussion of the work, including that it is perhaps the representation, as it were, of classical representation. For the philosopher of language, of course, it poses a special challenge in the theory of representation. But this picture even contains paradoxical aspects, is in part concealed from us by the fact that we live in an era when far more blatantly paradoxical pictures have become quite common. In addition to our awareness of entire movements such as surrealism and cubism that are paradoxical from the standpoint of classical pictorial representation, we're all used, for instance, to Steinberg's drawings of men drawing themselves being drawn, or Escher's staircases that rise to the end of other staircases and yet rise again. And until we're back at the bottom, and of course to Patrick's paradoxical pictures. On one side are all those radically paradoxical forms of pictorial representation. On the other is Las Meninas, from within the canons of classical pictorial representation. And then I'm proposing something else, which is my 4th point, and that is the idea of images coming together that belong to different realities. The collage, and further on, the museum as a collage, and this is reflecting a about contemporary modes of representation. And the question is, what is the relevance of the collage in artistic representation in relation to creating illusion? So the paradigm of the contemporary is that of the collage as defined by Max Ernst. This is Max Ernst's work, with one difference. Ernst said that the collage is the meeting of two distant realities on a plane foreign to them both. The difference is that there is no longer a plane foreign to distinct artistic realities, nor are those realities all that distant from one another. That is because the basic reception of the contemporary spirit was formed on the principle of a museum in which all art has a rightful place, where there is no a priori criterion as to what that art must be like, and where there is no narrative into which the museum's contents must all fit. Artists today treat museums as filled not with dead art, but with living artistic options. The museum is a field available for constant rearrangement. This part of this was taken from Danto's thoughts. And I was thinking of the thematic rehang of the Tate Gallery, which caused a lot of debate. So on a physical level, in everyday life, we're constantly inferring whole things from fragments, interpreting and making sense, perceptually, emotionally, and physically, out of apparent randomness and disorder around us. And shared experiences enable us to make sure that our consciousness corresponds to the outside world. The final, this was a picture that should have gone up when I was talking about the museum, which is a Thomas Roof picture. The final point is from my experience of working with artists in the Head-On exhibition, Art with a Brain in Mind, for which Colin wrote in the catalogue many years ago, so it's not fresh, but I've refreshed myself. We had a title there that was Things That We Think We See When We Don't, and Things That We Do See When We Think We Don't. So the question, which is a question that I care for a huge amount, is the relationship between the three-dimensional object translated into a two-dimensional representation as possibly the basis of the construction of visual illusion in all art as the main illusion. Questions of visual perceptions were explored by two artists. We had a number of artists, but two artists in particular with whom we worked very, very closely, also with the help of Uta Frith for one of them. They were Claude Heath and Tim O'Reilly for the exhibition at the Science Museum. Claude Heath did his experimentation by denying sight. He draws blindfolded, and the other by exploring binocular vision. The translation of a three-dimensional object into a two-dimensional representation is central to both artists, or is it to all artists? So Claude used his body as an extension of sight and draws blindfolded. He touches a three-dimensional object, which is often the sculpture of a head, frequently that of his brother Toby. Questions of familiarity are important for Claude as well. And he touches it without seeing it. And he produces marks on paper in a systematic way, visually mapping the root of his tactile experience. So it goes like this. He touches with one hand and he draws with the other. It's a way of scanning visually. His work is essentially process-based with an outcome that is literally unforeseen until completion. He remains blindfolded until the very end of the drawing. And he starts the drawing from a fixed point at the top of the head, marking this spot with a piece of blue tack. You can see it in the slide, two little round empty spots. And that's the head of Toby, his brother. Whereas Tim O'Reilly explores the faculty of visual perception, the outside three-dimensional world and its two-dimensional representation. He questions fundamentally the certainty of the direct correspondence between the outside world and its subjective representation by using visual tricks to lead us into bidimensional illusion of a three-dimensional world In contrast with Claude Heath, he uses old art practices such as drawing. And Tim makes use of new technologies, however. He does refer to old technologies, obviously the 19th century stereoscopic device invented by Charles Wheatstone, which was developed not so much for public entertainment as in the context of research into the nature of vision. And like his images, O'Reilly's work present illusionism par excellence. His images give a sense of solidity. This is a sky, windows and sky, and pretend to exist in reality, proposing themselves as representation of an existing three-dimensional world, a bit like animated movies, I think. In fact, all of Tim's worlds are invented, and they exist only in the images and not in any freestanding reality. He says this sense of solidity occurs somewhere in our brain, and it is not present in the pictures unless they are seen in the right way. What intrigues me about illusion in general, and these are Tim's words, and stereo illusion in particular, is that they seem to raise a question about where exactly the picture is in relation to us when we look at it. It is a property of the physical image and of our visual mental system, or does it exist somewhere between the two, between both actual and mental, simultaneously? Just as the early stereoscopic pictures made at the same time as the invention of photography were hand-drawn images of simple and usual rectilinear objects, cubes or lines or steps, Tim's images, Tim himself uses simple geometric form for his computer-generated images. And these forms then assume the shape, the recognizable shape of a lamp, or a book, or a briefcase, or playing cards. And after all, does not the whole of art production and visual representation more generally function as a trick of the mind? I must finish with a sentence from Gombrich, because I know that Martin wants to begin from Gombrich, so this is in homage to Martin, to thank him very much for having accepted to share this with me, because I thought I was going to not be in the condition to do it. Gombrich says that the paradoxical formulation is that the world does not look like a picture, but a picture can look like the world. So I need Martin now.
Immaculate timing.
Perfect, thank you. I had to pick fast, but...
How do I get my presentation up on this computer with a blank screen? I use a Mac, so I'm not going to start fiddling with that. So anything can happen.
Are you going to use Mac there?
No, I've got a memory. It's in here in the memory stick.
Okay. Yeah.
This is the question. How many professors of neuroscience does it take to test the PowerPoint presently? The answer is n plus 1. So 1 is the technical.
I don't
Is it one of these?
The technician said he was the guy said he was coming back in 25 minutes, so he should be here.
Martin Campbell.
It's EHG, yeah, put that on the slide. Yeah, there we are. Brilliant. Thank you, Colin. I think this is the first time I've given a paper at, what, 48 hours notice. So you can blame Marina if it's slightly shambolic. We certainly haven't coordinated this at all, but I did say to her, mention Gombrich to make it seem.
Blame if it's very shambolic.
Both of us. Yeah. Anyway, I thought it would be interesting, I said it would be moderately interesting, to reflect on an engagement with Gombrich and thinking about his classic book, Art and Illusion, which somehow has got somewhat lost, as if it's some kind of archaic memorial. And is it still actively looked at?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, right, in art history it's not. Social deconstruction is not terribly interested in art and illusion. Anyway, that's the problem with art history. Okay. When my first ever job was in the Maritimes in Canada for 1 year, and I went across on a boat, which was a gruesome experience, being sick every day. But I read Art and Illusion, I think, 3 times on the way across. And it was absolutely fundamental to me. And I wasn't a direct student of Gombrich, but he was a kind of mentor. And he did say on occasions that I was one of his pupils, which I was delighted by, but was never such in a formal way. And it still seems to me that the book, Art and Illusion, has a great deal for us. I'm calling it Back and Beyond, looking back to Gombrich, back to those readings I did more years ago than I'm going to confess about, to reflections I've had in a somewhat incoherent way along the way. It would be interesting, nice little mini project for someone to look at the covers of Art and Illusion over the years, and to look at the Gombrich archive and to see the correspondence about who chose what, how it came about, and so on. In fact, Night Cowther was one of the covers which he was most fond of. But it would be interesting to see as an exercise in publishing, but also an exercise in how far they reflect some changing interests of Ernst in relation to the particular covers. You will know the basic Gombrichian outline, but let me give it in my words because it will help you into what I'm subsequently going to say. The notion of schemata, the means for a recognizable depiction which exists at a given time, that is to say, the mode of representation which is understood at the time as signifying a figure, whatever is the particular subject of the painting, and that schemata is the established making, which you begin by making an image, accepting those means of doing it. I'm not calling them conventions, because that's not the term which he himself would have wanted to use. It's then subject to the process of matching, very closely linked in with Popperian, Karl Popper's ideas of hypothesis and falsification. I don't know if anybody's undertaken a study of Popper and Gombrich, but again, that would be a nice study for somebody to do, at least up to master's thesis level, of looking at the systems of thought and the social relationships of Gombrich and Popper, which were also foundational to how they interacted. But anyway, the relationship of Popper's notions of scientific progress or scientific change and Gombrich's ideas of progress, genuine progress in illusionistic representation, are very closely locked in together. There is in this scheme for Gombrich a kind of default position which is a relatively primitive set of schemata, or a primitive schematum, that other things being equal, without other pressures, there is a sense of gravitational pull towards the schemata, and to get towards something which is sophisticated representation is a struggle. And basically, Art and Illusion is about those centuries of struggle from Egypt to Kunstler. And without the continual pressure, as it were, to resist that gravitational pull, you will get back to some kind of more basic system of representation, which you see in primitive art. And he used the term primitive in a rather all-embracing and, I think in some ways, rather an unhappy way. The equation is obviously with the schemata. This is something that we know. We know the shape of an eye. We do have the schemata for an eye, and we represent it, but obviously in the context of a complex portrait, three-quarter face, and this all needs heavy modification, which for him becomes a kind of heroic act of resisting that gravitational pull. At the other end of the pull, in that book, Constable is the great exemplar, a kind of hero of the book, and implicitly photography. The system of naturalistic representation, which he sees rightly in historical terms as hard won. And I think whatever people's views of Gombrich in terms of brain sciences, I think as a description of a historical process of the forging of Constable-style naturalism, it's still a very compelling account, even if we wouldn't use exactly the same mechanisms to explain it. In this case, he looked towards, as you probably know, brain sciences, particularly experimental psychology, and his links with Richard Gregory are obviously incredibly important here, not only with Richard, but I think of the people working in experimental psychology that they had the most attuning in relation to the kind of art they admired as well. Ernst did not really like 20th century art, and that's going to be quite a fascinating study as to how far what he says about historic art is actually not consistent with his dislike of contemporary art, if that makes sense. Anyway, let's look at the schema, and I'm proposing for the schema we substitute what I'm calling signs of minimum resemblance. And these are, for me, a complex set of signs, like you can use a lollipop with a green lollipop to represent a tree, but there's not a kind of stable set or even a gravitational pull towards some core set of things. There may be in brain science, but there's not in representation. And I think we should get away from the idea there is some kind of primitive schematum which art gravitates towards, which you can see in African art or whatever, which Ernst tended to see as being the case. I think what is happening is there are a series of minimum resemblances. You know, if I want to draw a figure, there are certain minimum things which will key it, but that is context-based, and it needs an active reading, and we need to know the field that we're operating in here. And this combination of signs of minimum resemblance can be permutated in various ways, and that fundamentally they're rather sophisticated, they're not primitive. Let me make that point with an example, or two examples, related examples. I've been photographing signs on toilet doors, which doesn't get me a very good reputation, I have to say. But it is absolutely fascinating as to how little you can do to make people understand. But of course, this is context-based. We know if we're this is the Mori Museum in Japan. This is the Mori Tower Block in Japan. We know if we're looking for a toilet, there are going to be two signs. We know that they're going to have some kind of humanoid quality, and we know that they're going to be masculine and feminine, so we look for the differentiators between the two signs. We're not looking to see whether the sign actually looks like a bloke or a woman. And it's interesting culturally that women generally wear skirts. My family is Scottish, so this is quite an interesting question. So this does a remarkably good job in a way, doesn't it? In a very, very puzzling way. We accept it easily, but this is not primitive. This is very sophisticated. We know that these are toilet doors. We know what we're looking for. We know what job to do with it, i.e. male-female differentiation. We know we don't do other jobs with this image. This is a London restaurant. From the side, normally they're frontal. It probably means that men are not very accurate. But what do men do if they want to sit down? Anyway, it bears thinking about. Again, you know, in the restaurant I didn't have much doubt as to where I was meant to be going. It's a very bizarre system, isn't it? And yet very sophisticated. This is not primitive. They're primitive schemata. It's about as primitive in that sense, or as basic a schematum as you can have, or schemata, two of them. Yet it's incredibly sophisticated in terms of the framework of viewing we need to bring to this to make any sense of it at all. And I think that's so of all these basic schemata. Yesterday, in this manic round before I got off to the Monaco Grand Prix, and we'd just come back from Princeton, I went into the British Museum African galleries. I thought I needed some visual nourishment. And if you walk around the African galleries, I would defy you to come up with any minimum schemata which those African works of art are using. They're very sophisticated in function, in form, links to spiritual elements and so on. And they're as sophisticated as this. The schemata are often more complicated, but they're as sophisticated than that in the cultural context of viewing. And I think that would apply to any art form which has undergone sophisticated evolution over a series of years. And it's at least as complicated as looking at those things. For the naturalistic element, I'm substituting perceptual triggers for this sense that Ernst conveyed, that, and Marina had that lovely quotation from him, that you can make pictures look like the world and that there are fundamental aspects of resemblance they share in common. I'm not questioning that, but I think it might be better to think about a set of perceptual triggers. That's to say, artists have learnt over a period of time that certain things we are familiar with, like two lines looking as if they're converging to a point, these basic perceptual triggers which are so essential for us, that we're not in a sense making things that look like the world, but artists have learnt to play particular tricks to activate these triggers to produce an effect. So it's a way of exploiting something which wasn't meant to be used in this way. And I prefer that in a sense to thinking there is a direct one-to-one match, which there obviously isn't in this kind. In this case, the perceptual triggers, the most potent ones, are obviously the coffered ceiling, to which I'll be coming back to, and the tapestries, also, which I'll be coming back to, which provide this very compelling illusion to which contemporaries testify, even in its present wrecked state. It doesn't work badly as an illusion. And we have an amazing ability to accommodate inconsistencies of all sorts in a painted illusion, because we know it's a painting. I think we suspend our judgment in a very different way than if we're looking even at a photograph, and certainly at the real view. One of the properties I think that we can differentiate in pictorial images is that they can simultaneously present inconsistencies which we're untroubled about. Looking at a real view, we may be completely fooled as to what it is, but we seek that inner consistency. And in a painting, we can deal with these inconsistencies. This is Domenico Veneziano, one of the first great unified altarpieces, moving from a polyptych, say in this case a three-panel structure, into a unified perspectival structure in early 1440s, the St. Lucie altarpiece and the Uffizi. This is a lovely example for me because it contains absolutely contradictory clues which we don't really bother about until they're pointed out. We're able to float these two things together in a funnily simultaneous way. For instance, we see four saints there, the Virgin sitting under a loggia framed by a shell niche. The shell niche, if you think about it, is a long way back. You've got a space before, after the loggia. You've then got that five sides of an octagonal structure, kind of garden hexadra. So it's a long, long way back. Then we look at if you want to do it yourself, you can do it. You mask off the upper part of the thing, and those columns with their arches sit absolutely flat on the picture plane. They adhere to the picture plane. They clearly don't if you then mask the upper part of the picture. The columns do have a slight tendency to come forward, but basically they sit in space. Now you can say this is like the duck-rabbit illusion, and we can use it like that. I can switch you, but it's not. It's not a duck-rabbit illusion at all. Somehow or other, we untroubledly deal with this. And looking at this, let's think where it is. It was originally in the church in Florence. It's now in the Uffizi. We go in, even if we're a tourist, we know we're going in to see Italian old masters. We'll probably know it's a Virgin of Saints, and we'll have some residual sense that the earlier pictures we walked past in the gallery are triptychs or polyptychs. So we know what sort of job we're doing with this thing. And it's only funny art historians like me who start to unpick these inconsistencies and make you aware of them. Once you're aware of them, of course, you can't quite get away from being aware of them. But in the actual viewing of the object, in its time, when people were very expert viewers, of course, they knew exactly what to do with this kind of image. We have to be educated as to what to do with these images in a way. But we both bring incredibly complex expectations to them. The Last Supper, full of inconsistencies, sleights of hand which are very deliberate, which we don't be aware of. The coffered ceiling, as we know, somehow disappears up behind those lunettes to to a point you can more or less define if you make some assumptions, but of course we don't do that when we're looking at it in a normal way. The tapestries, the ratio of the widths of the tapestries measured on the surface of the picture are 1 to a half to a third to a quarter. Now this means there is no way you can rationally reconstruct that space to make the tapestries equal width. We're not perceptually aware of this. Leonardo knew this looked okay. Why did he do these ratios? It's basically his conception of perspective as a kind of spatial music. So this is a basic Pythagorean setup. I don't do much in surface geometry. I don't like it. For the most part, it's not present in Renaissance pictures. But in this case, Leonardo could have made these tapestries the right width very easily in relation to the basic scaling of the perspective throughout. And there are other funny things going on, which we can see better if we take the figures out. First of all, of course, there's all the things that have been talked about. There's not space for the disciples behind the table. There's not space for the two to be seated at the end. But there are also other very puzzling and interesting things going on. What is this strip here? It's very damaged at the bottom, so don't trust that. But if you look up at the top there, it's two things, isn't it? It's the base of that cornice section, but it's also somehow or other part of this wall. So it's both parts of the frame and part of this continuous wall. Very subtly done. You're not meant to ask about it. Once you ask about it, of course, it again becomes complicated. But again, it's not, I think, essentially Dapper Rabbit. It's a pictorial device, and we work with pictures in a way rather differently than if we were looking at the real thing. And of course, context. This is where Marina and I join up here. The contemporary viewer going into the refectory on the left would see the monastery tables, would see the high table set in the same orientation as Christ's table in the upper room. The biblical account is the Last Supper in the upper room, so this works perfectly well. They would see the meal, they would see the bread, they would see the wine. There would be a whole context there. Ludovico Sforza, the patron of this, dined weekly in the refectory of Santa Maria delle Grazie. So those are very expert viewers. They bring a lot to it. I, as an art historian, go in and I look at certain things because I'm interested in Leonardo in certain ways. But everyone visiting this goes in with a very complex bag of expectations. Whether they're highly informed or less informed, I think the quantity of expectation that tourist has is not different in the quantity of expectation I have. It's just a different set of expectations. So yesterday I just briefly mentioned in response to Jonathan Miller and the rocking horses that I think we need to take into account rather carefully what sort of thing we do when we're looking at a picture type thing. It's messy, noisy, contextual. The work that Andrew and I did with Holly Bridge and Mainfrey Hang was one aspect of getting at the psychophysical factors, at the sheer complexities of these things. And my view is that one of the most tractable sets of problems we have in art history and in current brain science is about the contexts, about assumption, about ways of viewing. Rezeption is a big thing in the history of art, perhaps less big than it was a few years ago. But I think it's in that area of reception, what we see, how we see it, that a lot of the fruitful work can be done. And we can define mutual problems, ones which you have, which the brain scientists have leverage on, which artists like Patrick and so on are perpetually interested in this strangeness. And viewing Patrick's work, of course, we know that we're doing something very peculiar looking at these works, that they are works of art, they're in art galleries for the most part, and our expectations are continually confounded by what he does, but the expectations are incredibly important at the starting point, I think. Anyway, my message is context, 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 which links in with Marina. Okay, thank you.
Marina. We have lots of time for discussion. I was particularly obviously interested in this top-down idea, the context idea, and it occurred to me that, at least in the circles I move in, the dominant theme in perception, explanations of perception, is a Bayesian approach, which is actually exactly the same as what Gombrich was talking about, because you have your prior expectations, you have your evidence, and then you adjust on the basis of the evidence. You have to adjust your prior expectations. And so what I call the priors, you call the context. And I was wondering, when Marina was talking about what happens in museums now, our prior seems to be that there is no prior, which is a very high level. Tony.
If I can address the question, both of you, but really I just want a clarification. I'm not quite sure what the title, the paradox, I wasn't quite sure how to give your talk, interpretation of the paradox of representation. Was it about the asymmetry of intentionality? Is that what you meant? Sorry?
Sounds good.
Well, I wasn't sorry, am I interpreting it for you?
I think it was about the paradoxical nature of representing, for me, a three-dimensional world into a two-dimensional representation, which has a number of paradoxes. So, you know, a more sort of global sense.
No, the reason I was the quotation you end with, which is the link.
Yeah.
In a sense that, please excuse me, it reminds me of basically what Nelson Goodman was talking about. That it's not similarity, that won't do. Concept. And in fact, since you showed Aquinas, of course Brentano was taking it from Aquinas, and it was Aquinas. In fact, Brentano was actually differing from Aquinas. From Aquinas' point of view in the Summum Bonum, he is actually, one could say from the divine point of view of intentionality, that it is similar. God is here, you is now. I mean, actually, what's being represented in those fingers is arguably, sorry, let me come back to that, it's arguably double.
Well, I'm sure Martin would say something about that, but I was wondering whether I should bring in the idea of imitation of nature, because that's very important as well.
I mean, it's just Mark, I was slightly, I wasn't quite sure of the thrust of, when you say, can I just say, I'm going to be slightly critical. When you say context, in psychology, when people say context, it's really an excuse for not specifying. What I mean is, they say the context, and one has to really, I'm not saying it to you, but one wants to specify what exactly you mean by that. Do you mean something that's at the same level, or do you mean a presupposition? Or, I mean, you see, you need to have a theory of how framing works, in a sense. And often framing is not prior. It can be both in many visual illusions and in visual effects. What's the frame and what isn't? There's a dynamic. The whole point of the kind of thing that Patrick was coming to is that in fact, what's the frame, i.e. the point of stability against which its relative movement or relative location is questioned by those things. And my right, I was replying to Patrick, you don't have to look at modernist things. Back in the 15th century, I've seen both in Italian churches and in British, in English, I should say, churches in wood, cases where you've got bas-reliefs with a frame, somebody is represented inside, and their foot is on the frame, doing exactly the same as Magritte. And that wonderful ironic statement seems to be subverted. And that's why, when you say context, I want a theory of, do you mean something prior that you bring to it, or something that's invoked?
I mean both. I mean, if in fact, I mean, you say about context, that's actually what I was talking about. The Last Supper, the refectory, the religious users originally. There's not a single stable context. It's a very changing context, and that picture is useful because it stayed in the same place. Yet the context is physically the same. The mental context, the context of viewing, who actually has access to it, have totally changed. So, yeah, but a historian spends all their time, if they're any good, as a historian rather than a theorist, defining context. So,
Well, so, I mean, you did make a point about it. People at that time reading it, and that's absolutely right. It's a point that Gombrich makes as well. People at the time, I don't know, Pico, Vicino, they knew that this was a form of Neoplatonism.
Leonardo's representation has got almost nothing to do with Neoplatonism.
No, but when
it's Aristotelian. I'm sorry.
The harmonics are.
I'm sorry, you're putting this out in a terrific generalised way. That is inaccurate. Leonardo extracted order from nature. He absolutely wasn't a...
Well, the harmonics are. The Pythagorean harmonics are.
But they're extracted from nature. They're absolutely not derived in a Platonic form from some sort of...
But it's a... All right, the question, they thought of it like that.
It's experimental painting. It's
Yeah,
derived from observation.
Exactly.
Vicky.
I've got a very simple and simple-minded request, really, for Martin, rather than a question. And the request is, could I possibly have a set of your toilet doors? Because I don't know if you've done the experiments, but there's some lovely experiments you could do with that to actually look at one of the issues to do with prior context and simultaneous comparative context.
Right.
So what I was particularly struck by with the second pair, I really want to see how that female looks without the male one.
Yeah, indeed.
Because actually there's a whole set of associations that one seems to bring to bear. It's not just about posture, it's about quantity, it's about a load of things. But I don't know whether that, in isolation, is, you know, female versus male. So I would absolutely love to do some experiments, a student project or whatever, but I don't particularly want to go around taking lots of pictures of toilet doors, and you've probably got the best examples.
Yeah, I haven't got it. It's a kind of slightly fractured project, which I haven't got enough, but I'll be happy to pass them over. But it occurred to me, just looking at them and thinking about them, I've never written about these consistently. I've just collected them up on a whim, as it were, thinking it'd be nice to do this, that there are obvious, relatively straightforward experimental things you could do with it.
Absolutely straightforward. And the sorts of ones that students love to do as projects.
My suspicion is to think about the male symbol bent like that with a dot on top. I think outside the toilet, you wouldn't know whether the person was bending forward or backwards.
Yeah.
But it'd be interesting to see and to isolate them from the toilet door situation and simply see whether these schemata work at all with people.
And then you can muck about with them and actually see how clever was that design. Have they got that angle exactly right? Or is it just fortuitous? So it would be a lovely
let's do this. I have a less complete set than you might hope, but since
you don't need terribly many, and one can always add to them, and you can manipulate them. It would be great fun.
Yeah, I tell you, I've got Norman Foster ones from the airport, the one north of London, whatever it's called. Yeah.
The Busaba Itai ones that you put up, they're at 90 degrees to each other. So you don't actually, in the restaurant, you don't see them side by side unless you're puzzled and you scan the doors.
Oh, right.
So I think typically, the ladies is the door that faces you as you go to the toilets. You have to turn to go to the gents.
Right.
So for them to work, in fact, you have already to have some expectation that must be the ladies.
Yeah, right. We went, there was a dinner after a pornography conference. We went to that restaurant. I'd even forgotten its name. So. Yeah,
the Institute is beside by Itai all the time. It's just on Store Street. We can all do an experiment.
What's your name again?
Busaba Itai.
Okay, right.
Do people ever make errors and go the wrong one?
Can I just suggest something in relation to your planned project? That when you do the project, you may consider involving a designer or an artist, but a designer from our university. We have those, some others.
You know, you can go from very, very simple questions with using these materials to much more complex questions, and the questions can be more oriented towards the sorts of things I have published on, which is how we tell the difference between male and female faces, and just trying to, you know, you can do simple-minded experimental psychology using these as very interesting things. We could go all the way through and say, well, how perfectly have they done the triggers there by manipulating them? But there's a whole range of stuff there, and it just...
My point was more to do with the fact that, you know, the point about the context, that actually, I can't tell you exactly, but if you do work with a designer from your scientific point of view, you discover that the kind of context that comes out, maybe you shouldn't call it context, we call it something else. It's the training, or the trained eye in some way. It's amazing, I think, Anya Hulbert in Newcastle worked with Claude
She's a colleague
Heath.
of mine in Newcastle.
Yeah, okay. She worked with Claude Heath, and he actually altered her experiment because he said, I cannot do that because as an artist I have to move back many steps to look at the drawing.
Yeah.
She was looking at the drawing like this, like somebody who reads a paper.
Yeah.
And he said, no, you've got to move back. So, it's useful because you're using somebody's trained.
Just briefly again, it would be worth throwing in some cultural untidiness into this as well, and the extent to which these are international symbols. And the other funny things like men stand with their legs together and women stand with their legs apart in most of these signs.
I just follow up with one thing is that, I mean, these things are notionally cultural, and I'm curious to know, it would be interesting if one could discover innate patterns that, I mean, I've tried doing this once, using certain types of icons that you see in sort of Matisse cutouts that I think might be innate language for recognizing figures.
Yeah.
And I just thought, well, can I do an innate thing that might do a male, an innate one that might do a female, trying to access. So something not cultural, but something that's actually sort of, might be something, a hidden innate cue that we put onto every male and onto every female. It'd be quite nice. And I sort of did it, actually. It's quite curious.
Yeah, my guess is not in context, but we should come out of the toilet, I think.
This is kind of for both of you, or either of you. What is a pictorial illusion? So, you might think about it in terms of producing false belief, but I mean, if we had, say, an illusionistic portrait of me, I would never believe it is me. I mean, that would be ridiculous, and, I don't know how many other people would really believe that it's, me in there rather than an image of me or whatever. In the perception, so encouraging false belief doesn't seem like the right thing. In the perception case, people often talk about illusions as misrepresentations, but I'm not sure if that carries over so well. Pictorial illusion, or something that we described as illusionistic, I don't know if I'd want to say that it's always going to be a misrepresentation, and often it might seem to be more accurate than other painting. So what is a pictorial illusion?
What's the first one you said?
Encouraging false belief. So, the sort of trompe-l'oeil idea.
Yeah.
But, how does that ever really happen?
Yeah. It's interesting that you say, if you see a portrait, a picture of you, you wouldn't say that's me. And yet, I look at photographs a lot, and I work with photographs. And yet, when we look at a photograph, we say, this is my mother. This is my father, this is my son.
Sure.
We don't say this is an image of my mother. We never.
Oh, yeah.
So, and the same with paintings, but it's striking with photographs. And I've exercised this, not saying this is my mother, but saying this is a photograph taken of my mother. That distance is not there in language. And I wonder how much that impacts. I don't know. And I don't think I can measure it. But all I'm saying is that there is some suspense and there is some illusion there.
Well, but you don't believe, you don't believe that the thing...
No, of course not. Of course not.
I mean, the subject is you, and in that sense, this is a pipe, in the Magritte
we welcome
thing.
the image to be there. We really receive that image. Of course it's not. But there is a tendency to go towards that, maybe imitation of nature, maybe that's a recognition. I mean, that's just one point.
I don't find the terms sort of false belief or deception or whatever terribly helpful in this case. I think if I reverted back to my idea of perceptual triggers, it's doing a particular job, and I don't think we need this rather loaded language to do that. But of course, to take the example of a picture of somebody, a face, in the history of art, this can be incredibly varied. The portrait is a relatively new thing. If you take an image of an Eastern Orthodox icon of the Virgin, which has certain kinds of resemblance, but is not illusionistic in that sense. Yet that becomes, in a sense, a surrogate for the Virgin. The Eastern Orthodox icon has some real presence embedded in it, almost like the Eucharist, not exactly the same. So over the course of history, the job you do with these images and how far they stand as actual surrogates and indeed have some of the properties of the original image is very variable. I mean, one of the things I'd love to do is, we talk about sort of expert viewers, but I'd love, and Andrew Parker knows about this, I'd love to do something around Eastern Orthodox icons and look at how somebody who uses them to devotional purposes looks at them, how somebody who's moderately an art expert in, I don't know much about icons, but somebody like myself, or somebody who is more than a member of a less expert body of public, and see what job they do with them. But I'd love to do devotional images and test how they work. Maybe somebody's already done this.
Well, actually, it's a wonderful, when I was talking about photography in that sense, I've now remembered that when I looked at the Ottoman Empire in Venice, and I was looking at the period of iconoclasm under the Empress Irene, so we're talking about the 7th century, and the representations in Cappadocia, that was a period when that identification was totally there, that the icon was the saint. And so that's what I'm saying, you know, that distance, and that is like that. I mean, it is actually, you don't need that far away. You can just get a Catholic, just get me, and you get my childhood. The Madonna was the sculpture that, she was the Madonna. You know, she wasn't a sculpture of the Madonna, she was the Madonna.
Yes,
my friends-in-law were certainly planning to do a study along these lines.
Right, okay.
But I don't know how far it's got college units.
Just thinking about your assertion that there are no fundamental symbolic forms, there aren't universals in forms of symbolic representation of things. If that's true, then the notion of using deliberately inaccurate forms of representing familiar things happened very early. I mean, I'm thinking of in the earliest forms of representational art in Neolithic times in Europe, 20,000 years ago or more, simultaneously with beautifully representational carved human figures, fertility figures and so on, you had representations in cave art, in Lascaux, painted art, which almost assiduously avoided the human figure, and when it was represented, it was in a highly symbolic form, stick figure form in Lascaux. So simultaneously in Lascaux, where the quality of the painting representation is quite extraordinary of animals, you get these ridiculous stick figures. So the notion that something that a symbolic form could stand for the appearance of a real thing was derived very early.
There are two things about that. I didn't mean that there wasn't within procedures of perception and cognition certain kinds of archetypal forms. I was saying if we look at representations, that explanation is not sufficient because the kit of these that's assembled with representations is very variable, very different, and it works within a certain communicative field in each case. But I always find it very difficult to use prehistoric art for anything in this area. Let's just think what we've got here. It's rather as if, given the time scale, we've got the Laocoon, we've got Michelangelo's Sistine Ceiling, and Picasso's Demoiselle d'Avignon. You know, that's what we've got there is at least part of an incredibly complex build-up to that level of sophistication. I mean, the cave art in these images don't come out of nothing. They're just completely isolated with gaps between them, and we don't really have any concrete idea other than hypothesis what their function is. So we're pretty well informed about the function of medieval art, say, but the timescales are vast, they're incredibly isolated, and to say anything coherent about them historically, other than in a very speculative way, is, I think, incredibly difficult.
But I think what you were saying, Colin, if I'm not wrong, is that there is a kind of hidden different order of interest. The animals pictured in a very detailed, very sophisticated way, and the humans hunting them as matchstick figures. So that there is probably, I don't know, but there is a difference, there is a choice in representation. It's not that the prehistoric images are matchsticks.
We also, of course, have to
you can choose to represent both.
We also have to be clear that in making that assertion that they actually were part of the same process of manufacture.
The timing.
Well, they're known absolutely that the matchstick men and the naturalistic animals
not
were...
to the day, but well, 1,000 years.
This is exactly my point.
Yeah.
So there are cases where they are. In fact, one of the objects in the VAF one is of the carved handle of the where there's the I can't remember which animal it is. One animal, another animal watching, and behind it, or carved on the thing, is a stick figure holding.
I was thinking in the same image.
Yeah, they're in the same image.
And there is a hierarchy of cultural hierarchy.
But there's a necessary question to ask, which I've asked and which has been answered. You then say, why is that? And we have absolutely no clue as to what the functional purposes are of the image as a whole, and indeed the discrete parts.
Or a kid might have drawn a child.
I think there are probably enough of these to say that this is the case.
Yeah, I just have to make a reference back to language, because when Marina was making the point about the photo, and this is a photo of my mother, I'm Swedish, and in my language we would say, yes, this is a photo of, but when it comes to a painting, we would never, in good language, say this is a painting of. We would use the Swedish word föreställa, and you would probably better understand it if I use the German word vorstellen. And why vorstellen, and why this is? Vorstellen because a painting is a composition over time of this image. It's not an image in the moment, while a photo in our perception is an image of the moment. So we would never use the same sort of language reference when talking about these two different pictures.
You should do a study of Swedish brains.
This is not brain, this is culture again.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Just the Italian footnote to this, which is sort of quite fun, maybe not very meaningful, is that in Italy, in the Renaissance and presumably subsequently, a marble block, which was about 6 feet high and had a satisfactory width, was called a figura.
I think well, our last question. We've got 1 minute. Yeah.
All right. You talked about the illusion. And did Picasso then concentrate on the illusion? And culturally, where does Mondrian fit in, if he fits in at all?
Well, Mondrian's allusions are to theosophical metaphysics, not visual in that sense.
But your question is general, not just Picasso as Meninas. It's a general question. I think pictorially in this way, in this sense, and I think of the stripping down. You know, there is a lot of stripping down pictorially that one does as an artist to represent, because you are bombarded by, at least I'm talking as being bombarded by visual representation. You've got to make a good job of it. You've got to get it down on paper, on canvas, or on film, or wherever. You've got to simplify it. So there is a great job to be done of stripping down, simplifying, even when it turns out in the end to be complicated. But your example, Picasso and then Mondrian, thinking of Matisse, it all speaks of that stripping down in the Renaissance, Middle Ages in a different kind of ways. There are formulas to render an image a good image. When do you begin, when do you end, when do you say this painting is finished? It's a lot. I think, I mean, that is a different kind of worry that I have, and I think it suits the way we want to do something. It suits my own makeup, you know, how much I simplify. And then there are sort of general affirmations as well.
Formula, you don't mean mathematical?
No, I don't mean mathematical formula. No, I mean visual formulas.
But one of the aims of abstraction, as in Greenberg and the abstract expression, is to say there isn't an illusion. A picture is a picture, and to see if there's something fundamental which is just a picture, and it's entirely within that framework. Of course, there's a lot of context in that as well, because we're going into a gallery. We know what we're doing. We know we don't know much about abstraction. We know these are abstract pictures, but yeah, it's a fundamental aspect to say that there isn't an illusion. A picture is a surface, and we make the surface, we make colours on it, and that's it.
Just a final thing. I want to suggest, since you're all suggesting experiments and new studies to do, can I just suggest one? I think one should do a study on teaching children, very small children, primary school children, to draw a tree, or to draw a house, or to draw a person. If you ask a child to draw a tree, they don't even need to look at it. They just go with the matchstick tree, or with the tree with the sign that is conventionally known to be a tree. If you put, and I've done it with my children and their friends when they were 2, 3, 4, 5, you put them in front of a landscape and you say, now really look at that. Don't think that you know what it is, but really look at it. It's a fantastic experience. You know, they are faced with something that they have to interpret, and they don't come up with the standard tree at all. They do question an awful lot what they're seeing, and it's a wonderful, I don't know which schools they can be done in, but I think when I retire from what I'm doing now, I'm going to start teaching children.
Can I have just a 30-second anecdote? My grandmother, the only person in my family with any tertiary education, was a primary school teacher, and the children were drawing some landscapes, and one little bloke came up with a terrifically nice green landscape with trees, and he came up with a bit of blue sky and space in the middle, and she said, "What's that in the middle?" She said, it's fresh air, miss.